Good morning. We have formed a quorum. We have 10 members in attendance. I now call to order. Let's start the meeting of the panel on environmental affairs. Members, please confirm the 2 sets of minutes for the meetings held on the 27th of March and the 24th of April 2017. It's paper 1268 and 1297. The Secretariat hasn't received any proposed amendments so far, so can I take the minutes as confirmed? Thank you. Second item, information papers issued since the last meeting. Please note the list on the agenda. Now let's proceed to the agenda pop-up. Legislative proposal to mandate marine vessels to use compliant fuel within Hong Kong waters. The paper is a 1286-01 from the administration, and a 1286-02 is a background brief from the Secretariat. I would like to welcome government officials. Good morning, Secretary.
Good
morning. Secretary, please introduce the paper 1286-01. Chairman, good morning. Marine vessels are one of the major local air pollution emission sources. To reduce vessel emissions, we have introduced a number of measures. In April 2014, we introduced a statutory cap of 0.05 on the sulfur content of locally supplied marine light diesel. And in 2015, we require ocean-going vessels to switch to low sulfur diesel. And then we have also introduced a concessionary scheme to provide an incentive in respect of port facilities and light juice incentive scheme for ocean-going vessels that switch to the 0.5% sulfur fuel. The Environment Bureau has been in cooperation with the mainland in tackling the marine emission control. And in 2015, the Ministry of Transport issued an action plan for establishing 3 domestic emission control areas in the mainland waters, one of which is in the Pearl River Delta. Together with the Ministry of Transport, we signed, and also the Marine Safety Administration, we signed a cooperation agreement on prevention and control of air pollution from vessels so as to implement the relevant work on the PRD, the domestic emission control areas. This will provide a very good opportunity for Hong Kong to step up control over marine emissions in our own waters. We propose that starting from the 1st of January 2019, vessels have to use compliant fuel, and that is they have to use diesel with a sulfur content of 0.05% or less. In March this year, we consulted the relevant stakeholders, and they are in general supportive. We would like to table the new regulations in mid-2018 so that the new regulations can take effect in 2019. We have sufficient time for this item, so every member is given 3 minutes for questions and answers. Questions? Mr. Leung Yu Chung, please. We have more vessels in our Hong Kong waters, whether it's ocean-going vessels or river trade vessels from the mainland. So this measure can help reducing the marine emissions. I became a district councillor in 1985. At that time, in Kwai Ching district, we suffered from a very serious pollution problem. The boilers use fuel with high sulfur content. It's much more than 0.5%. It's as much as 8%. And Kwai Ching was one of the most polluted areas in Hong Kong. And when this rained, we are also suffering from the acid rain. Then we reduced the sulfur content of boiler fuel to 0.25%, so there was a significant improvement. So why are you just trying to reduce the sulfur content to 0.5% and not 0.25% as you did back then? I'll say a few words, and then I'll ask my colleague to supplement. We are all concerned about marine emissions, so we introduced two sets of regulations to regulate fuel used by vessels, as well as to require the switching of fuel at berthing. I'll defer to my colleague for the other question. The member is correct. A long time ago, in Kwai Chung, the fuel used for the boiler had a very high sulfur content, and then we reduced it to 0.5%, and now it's been further reduced later, and now it's 0.05%. But marine fuel is different from the fuel used by boilers.
For vessels, especially OGVs, they usually travel a long distance. So for the IMO, the requirement is much lower than that required for industrial use on land. And for the IMO is 3.5% in terms of the sulfur content of fuel for OGVs, and by 2020 the requirement is just lower to 0.5%, because OGVs are traveling a long distance. So in terms of the design of the vessels, the cost, they can't really use sulfur content which is very, very low in terms of the fuel, while the boilers are operating around the clock a day at that time. So at that time, industries or manufacturing played a very important role in Hong Kong. And you must see that there was a serious pollution problem. That's why you came up with this measure back then. We all know that sulfur can cause acid rain, and the problem is very serious. And there will be heavy pollution to land and waters. I understand that ocean-going vessels are traveling long distance, but I don't believe that, technically speaking, there can't be any improvements. If we can do it, if we could do it on manufacturing industries, why couldn't we have the same requirement for vessels as well? Ms. Zhang, well, let me try to explain it this way. The proposal this time is that we are implementing the measure earlier than the IMO, and the IMO is having such a requirement in 2020, and we are now doing it in 2019. So we are ahead of IMO. So in fact, we are tightening instead of relaxing the requirements. And also, we already have this OGV fuel at berth regulation that was implemented in 2015, and that applied only to OGVs which are at berth in Hong Kong. So this time round, we are further tightening the requirement, and that is you are required to switch to low sulfur fuel, not only at birth, but when the OGVs are coming into Hong Kong waters. And that applies not only to OGVs, but also local vessels and other vessels as well. So all the vessels will be covered. Mr. Kenneth Leung. Thank you, Chairman. I have looked at some documents in the past, and as one member asked, why is it that we are putting the silver cap at 0.5%? If you look at the IMO, the member states, the designated emission control areas is 0.1%. And the government said that the fuel with a 0.1% sulfur content may not be easily procured in this region. We will be working together with the mainland authorities to put up this low emission control zone in the PRD. And now you are setting the cap at 0.5%. This is not a very strict requirement. Can't we be more forward-looking in that we should have a stricter standard, say, set it at 0.1%? Hong Kong vessels have to use 0.05%. So your argument that it's difficult to procure such fuel is not very cogent, I would say. If we set up this emission control zone within the PRD, what will happen? Does it mean that we will have to amend the regulation again? So can you set up a mechanism under the regulation such that when we reach an agreement on the PRD, then you can really take things forward more smoothly? Okay, can you be more forward-looking? Thank you. In a nutshell, why are we not reaching 0.1% today? What we said before still stands. If you look at Asian ports, only a small number uses 0.1%. Most of them are using, say, over 0.1, 0.5% fuel. And for the PRD emission control zone, that the 0.5% will apply starting 1st of January 2019. So we want to be consistent with the standards within the region. Now, what happens in other parts? The IMO is using 3.5%. It will only use 0.5% in 2020. So we are moving ahead of the IMO. And we are actually 1 year ahead of IMO. Now, looking further ahead, we want that the same requirement applies across the entire region, so that vessels do not have to switch their fuel all the time when they traverse within the waters of the region. So in the mainland, they will be doing a review by the end of 2019 to see if a further tightening up will be done. And then we will take reference from what's happening then, and then see if we would like to further tighten up the standards. Now, in relation to the legislative mechanism, for changing the sulfur content, do you have to amend the principal ordinance, or would it be put in the schedule so that you can do it by way of, say, other means? Do you have any thoughts on that? Yes. What we are proposing is that we will do it by way of subsidiary legislation. So in the future, if there is going to be amendment, it will be by way of negative vetting. Mr. Stephen Ho, thank you, Chairman. For fishing vessels, they are already using 0.05% fuel. So this measure or proposal doesn't have significant impact on fishing vessels. Now, are there any vessels which are using fuel with a sulfur content above 0.05%? Let's get that straight first. Now, the paper says that the mainland authorities have designated the waters within the region in the PRD as regions using 0.5%. So that's why we need to make adjustments because we have to dovetail with the mainland requirements, because the vessels have to travel through mainland waters before coming into Hong Kong. So for the mainland authorities and also the environmental protection authorities, will they be looking at similar legislation in the future? The government officers said that we will look at whether there will be further legislation to be put in place. Well, if we are only doing that doing it by that approach, we will be lacking behind. We will not be following up the states or the national standards in a timely manner. Yes, the members' understanding is correct. For this proposal, apart from OGVs, other local vessels, including river trade vessels, will also be covered. In 2014, we also have put in legislation on the supply of local fuel. It comes with a statutory cap of 0.05%. in terms of the sulfur content. So in effect, whether it's the local vessels and the river trade vessels which will be brought into the scope of the new legislation in terms of their operation, there won't be too much impact. And it will only be the OGVs which will bear the brunt because they are now using some other types of fuel. And we have to work closely with the Guangdong authorities, the Shenzhen maritime authorities. We have set up a working group to study into the matter with them. We don't want to be, we want to be kept informed all along of what they are up to. And according to the proposal, they have set out all the plans for, say, 2016, 17, etc. And so by 1st of January 2019, they will implement 0.1% or 0.5%. And they said that they will conduct a review. Either the way forward will be either tightening up the standards or they will be looking into other technical options to minimize pollution. And we will be also studying into whether we can have some sort of remote monitoring of the emissions from vessels. So we will work closely together with them. So can I keep on asking, Chairman? Well, they said that there is this working group and the legislative amendment will be the first step in, say, in a package of measures to be rolled out. So I hope that the government can do more publicity, telling the public what direction they will be heading towards. Now, we are having 0.5% this time. Maybe later it will be 0.2, 0.1%, so that the vessels can be better equipped in the future. And I think the government should not play a passive role in all of these. You should tell the trade the direction you are heading so that they can get better prepared. So that also makes it easier for you to legislate in the future. So I have a question myself. When we talk about 0.5%, sometimes we talk about 0.05%. I get confused. And also, I also agree with Mr. Stephen Heung and Mr. Kenneth Leung that we should be more forward-looking. I know that by the end of 2019, there will be a review. If we look further ahead, well, 0.5% is the present target. And we will be talking about 0.25% or 0.1% in the future. So are we on the same chapter, on the same pace with other regions? So in 2020, 2023 or 24, we will be further tightening up the standards. What is the feasibility of further tightening? So please clarify the two figures, 0.5%, 0.5%. Well, the lower the figure, the better it is, of course, because we are talking about the sulfur content. Now, looking forward, should we be further tightening up 0.1% or 0.05%? Well, of course, the lower the figure, the cleaner is the fuel. And from the environmental protection perspective, the lower the figure, the better. But we have to consider first whether such fuel can be supplied. Now, we're just not talking about local vessels, because in 2014 we have already put a cap of 0.05% on locally supplied fuel, which is a 90% reduction already. But when we talk about OGVs coming into Hong Kong waters, what kind of fuel should they be required to be used? We have to see whether there is supply of such fuel in our neighboring ports. If there is no such supplies, it will be all empty talk. And this is not something that we want to see if there is no supply around the region. And we also communicate from time to time with the sector, and they said that we should take a regional approach. So in other words, within the region, the requirements should be consistent. So there should be a consistent approach. Then they will be given a level playing field if that is the approach. So if we consider lowering the sulfur content, so apart from looking at whether there is a ready supply of the fuel required, we will also be mindful of the trade and the ports operations as well.
That's the first round. Mr. Martin Liu, I have a simple question about enforcement. You are now regulating ocean-going vessels. You can check their logs. You can carry out surprise checks on the field. So what about law enforcement? Is it the job of the EPD or the Marine Department? I understand that the establishments of the EPD and the Marine Department are not substantial. But under the regulations, the proposed regulation, the law enforcement agency is EPD. It's just an expansion of the regulation on fuel at berth. So this is an expanded regulation. It will be done by the EPD. Are you going to increase the establishment to tie in? We are reviewing the manpower need. I believe we will need more to handle this new regulation. More than what we need for the fuel at berth regulation. Mr. Kenneth Leung, I want to ask a question about enforcement. For the berth at field requirement, you can check the vessels in Hong Kong waters. But what about ocean-going vessels passing Hong Kong? Are you going to conduct surprise checks on board, or are you going to check the emission of the exhaust fume? The Director? The IMO has designated 4 emission control areas. Before a vessel enters such zones, they will have to switch to compliant fuel. There's no way that we can come on board to check, and they will only be checked upon the entry into an port. That's the same as we are doing with the requirement on fuel at berth. So when a vessel is traveling we would carry out checks, surprise checks. We look at the logs and the procedure involved, which will be recorded. And how do we know that the field is actually switched when they are in motion? Or we'll use some remote sensing techniques or use drones to take samples from the air. This is still being tried out. We'll work out with the mainland authorities to see whether we can assess the compliance of the field switch requirement. Follow-up question? Mr. Xiu Ka-fai, first round, and then we have Mr. Hui Chi-feng. Mr. Frankie Yeager is unable to attend today's meeting, so I'm asking a question on his behalf. From the 1st of January 2019, the Ministry of Transport and the Marine Safety Administration has decided that vessels entering the Pearl River Delta Control Zone would have to use a fuel containing not more than 0.5%. And so instead of asking the vessels to switch to a low sulfur fuel upon berthing, and we have to maintain that they switch to a 0.5% sulfur diesel, the Hong Kong Liners Associations I have no in-principle objection to this, but it's said that the port facilities and light dues incentive scheme will come to an end at the end of next year, because this incentive will only cover 35 to 40% of the additional costs incurred for the switch to compliant fuel. And some joint ports are providing a bigger incentive, which will cover actually the 60 to 70% of the additional compliance cost. And it's not announced that some joint ports will cancel the incentive scheme after this new sulfur content requirement is implemented. And also, the Ministry of Transport would assess the effectiveness of the DECAs before deciding on whether to lower the content to 0.1%. And at present, fuel with 0.1% in sulfur is only commonly used in the US and Europe. So are we going to make reference to the requirements of some joint's incentive scheme when they introduce the requirement of 0.1% sulfur content, because the incentive scheme will cover 100% of the additional costs. The shipping industry is one of our traditional industries, and mainland operators have been taking away from Hong Kong big market shares. As you have heard, the Assumption is providing a bigger incentive or subsidy. If they do, and we in Hong Kong do not, our industry's market can easily be taken away. Deputy Director, with regard to the concession for port facilities and light use incentive scheme, it was introduced in 2012, and then in 2015, when we introduced the fuel at berth, regulation will extended incentive scheme up to the 31st of March 2018. I understand that the industry would like to get a level playing field in the regional setting. We are now conducting a study. We will see what the Samjun would do, but we haven't made a decision yet. At the appropriate juncture, before the end of this current incentive scheme, we would inform the industry of our decision. But we understand the industry's wish to have a level playing field in terms of the incentive or subsidy provided. I'm sorry, time is up. I'll be quick. If the sulfur content is further reduced for the Pearl River Delta region, what are we going to do? We are mindful of the need to be fair to all. If we want to tighten the fuel requirement further, we would consider the need to provide incentive. Mr. Hui Chi-Fung, of course, it's correct to tighten up the fuel requirement to control marine emissions. Vessels may switch to the fuel with 0.5% sulfur. There can also be other measures to tie in, such as getting power supply from the port. So are you going to provide such facilities when vessels are berthed, or to encourage them to switch to green fuels? So do you have any incentives with regard to shore power? When we at a subgroup to review the air quality indicators, they look into the green measures and the provision of shore power. At the container terminals, but they're suffering from a shortage of space and power supply, so they have difficulties to install the necessary facilities to provide power. And not many container vessels can use shore power. So according to the subgroup, this is not feasible as regards container vessels. As for cruises, only 10% of them would call at Hong Kong, but they mainly be calling at ports in North America. The IMO has already announced that by 2020, the sulfur content will be reduced to 0.5%. But there are already emission control areas, and also in anticipation of the tightening of the fuel content requirements by IMO, they will use scrubbers to reduce the emission of SO2, so that they can comply with the rules in the control zones, and also the future tightening of fuel requirements, and they will not be using shore power to achieve the same purpose. We'll monitor the development, but at the moment, shore power is not a feasible solution. Further questions? Mr. Ma Fung Kwok. According to paragraph 8, some vessels are exempt, including military vessels, or if compliance would pose a risk to the safety of the vessel. I can understand this. if we have vessels berth at our harbor, will be affected. Even for ocean terminal, from time to time, we see big military vessels, 40 to 50,000 tons. They will be there for 4 or 5 days. They will affect our air quality at the harbor. Are there administrative measures to prevent this? Well, we cannot bar them from entry into our waters, but can they be offer berthing or berths far away from residential areas? Well, if they just pass through our waters, that's okay. But if they are berthed here, can you do more? Do you have the powers to do more? The director, military vessels are exempted. If they continue to emit high contents of sulfur dioxide, what measures can you take to handle it? Yes, thank you for your question. Let me also explain. The international practice is that such regulations will not be applicable to the military vessels or ancillary vessels for military purposes. Well, I know that. I asked a question about whether you have administrative measures. Let me first of all cite a figure. Compared with big vessels coming to Hong Kong, we're talking about a very small portion under this category. Annually, we have 28,000 ocean-going vessels, big vessels coming to Hong Kong and berth in Hong Kong. In 2015, 2016, we only got 10 odd military vessels. I know that.
I don't know how come that the government officers don't seem to get my question. If they are berthed here, is it good? And if it is found to be not good, do you have any administrative measures for preventing them from being berthed there? So the regulation doesn't cover them. So that's why we can't come up with administrative measures to deal with it. But is it the case that they are berthed at the cruise terminals and so on? No, that's not the case. They would be, say, berths at berths in the western part, and they're not concentrated in Tsim Sha Tsui or the container terminal. And for some of the bigger military vessels, they have to berth even further away. So we don't mandate the locations where they should be berthed out. And if the member would like more information on which locations they can be berthed, maybe we have to seek further information from the Marine Department. Well, so your answer can be a simple no. You don't have to tell me so much. You haven't really answered my question. I'm asking you whether you have other administrative measures. Say, for example, you can talk to the ocean terminal management, ask them to stop military vessels from being berthed there. So it seems that you haven't considered this kind of plan at all. My question is simple. So if you live nearby the place where military vessels are berthed, then you don't find it good. So if they are berthed at the tourist areas and they are emitting pollution, they are creating pollution, then that's not good. So you can draw up administrative measures. We just have 2 cruise terminals in Hong Kong. Can't we do something about it? I have some personal experience on this. The pollution is really serious, especially near the ocean terminal. These are the tourist areas in Hong Kong. Mr. Ma is talking about what you can do as far as administrative means are concerned. Can you study into the matter? Yes, I can relate your views to Marine Department, which designates the berthing areas. I think the figures that I share are of relevance. Is it the case that military vessels will be emitting more smoke? Well, it depends on the size of the vessels. And also in terms of figures, OGVs are many more than the military vessels. So, well, if you have just a few military vessels, then it's all the more easier for you to deal with it. So EPD, you should put up the best efforts in tackling the problem. Secretary, yes, we will coordinate with the relevant departments to follow up on the matter. In the past couple of years, every year, 28,000 big vessels are coming into Hong Kong, and we have this switch of fuel at berth, and we have dealt with certain part of the problem. And Hong Kong is the first Asian city mandating the switch of fuel at berth, and we have dealt with over 99% of the problem, and I will definitely follow up on the concern raised by the member. Mr. Kenneth Leung, third round. I will be very quick. I would like to follow up on Mr. Ma's question. Mr. Ma, his question is very simple. For exempted vessels, what we want you to do is to try to do better in terms of the allocation of the berthing area. Of course, you can't deny entry of these vessels, but in terms of the allocation of the berthing area, you can do something more. For example, you can ask them to berth at waters outside Lama Island, on Stonecutters Island. There may be berthing areas for these vessels there. So this is what Mr. Ma is driving at. Can that be done? I think the Secretary has told us that he will talk to the Marine Department. Any supplement from you, Secretary? We appreciate Mr. Leung's concern. We will work together with the relevant departments to follow up. Any other further question? If not, then that's it for this item. I don't have any further question myself. So, in relation to paragraphs 6 to 12, those set out the proposals of the government, and the government says that it will try to strive to submit the new legislation to the Council in mid-2018. All right, so that's it for this item. Let's move on to the next one. All right, the next item is on the review of sixth technical memorandum for allocation of emission allowances for power plants, and the papers are 128603, 128604. So can the Secretary take us walk us through the paper first? Thank you. Power generation is one of the major sources of pollutants in Hong Kong, and the government has been following the Air Pollution Control Ordinance and has been issuing technical memorandum, TM, to power plants to put a cap on the emission from power plants. So far, we have issued 6 TMs, and the latest one, that is the 6th one, was passed by the LegCo in November 2016, and setting out the cap of emission from 2021. And we undertake that in 2017, based on the latest situation of the building of generation plants, of the power plants, to set out the cap on emission starting from 2022. We suggest to issue the 7th TM to further tighten the emission from the power plants starting from 2022. And compared to the 6th TM, the 7th TM in relation to sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and also RSPs will be decreased from 11% to 25%. So all the detailed processes have been set out in the paper. According to the APCO, before the new emission cap takes effect, we should issue the relevant TMs 4 years before the commencement of the TM, and we would be submitting to the LegCo in the middle of this year, then later CMs, and that will be subject to negative vetting. And so that the new TM will take effect by the end of 2017, so that the new cap will take effect in 2022. Thank you. So, members, any questions? Mr. Kenneth Leung? 4 minutes, including questions and answers. Thank you, Chairman. I have asked this question before. When I scrutinized the past TMs, I raised the same question. Of course, I welcome the reduction of, say, the RSPs and SO2, etc., in the TM. In relation to the emission of CO2, you said that you will reduce the carbon intensity by 50 to 60% by 2020. Now, I have asked this question, whether we can measure the carbon emission from power plants. I know that there are certain technical difficulties. I have 2 questions now. In terms of measurement of carbon emission at the chimneys of the power plants, do you have any new progress in the in technology? That's what I'm concerned about. And I know that for the US EPA, they in 2015 they have set up the carbon pollution standards for existing power plants, and I haven't looked into the details of these set of standards. But what kind of methodologies do they use to regulate the carbon emission of their power plants? I think that can serve as a reference. I am concerned about the emission of CO2 and how that can be tackled under the latest TM. 2 questions, Secretary. I understand that Mr. Kenneth Leung about carbon emission deduction and the climate change and so on. Now, we have local pollutants. We want to improve on that. So we would like to cut down on the emission of SO2, RSP, etc. So these are covered under the TMs. Now, for carbon reduction of carbon emission, well, that's a different concept. That will have an impact on the climate change, but the other pollutants have an impact on our pollution problem. So we can make measurement of carbon emission. We can also make calculations on carbon emission. So the carbon emission is a totally different matter from what we're discussing today. Can we include, say, a cap on carbon emission under the TM? Well, in the past few TMs, when we discussed that, I have also explained. We are using this best practicable means to resolve the problem. We will try to install carbon emission devices, etc., to cut down on carbon. But so far, we don't have the technology to install certain devices within the power plants to cut down on carbon emission. In foreign jurisdictions, they try to collect some carbon and then try to store it deep underground, and that's how they deal with it. But in Hong Kong, we don't have such deep formations in Hong Kong for us to store such carbon. So we don't have the technology to do it yet. So that's why we can't incorporate a carbon indicator in the TM. But if we talk about the fuel mix, if we are going to use more natural gas, then that can cut down on CO2. But that's not what we consider as one of the best practical means to cut down on CO2 emission. I think the administration has misunderstood me. You want to wait till the second round because your time's up. I'm not talking about carbon capture. That's not what I'm asking. And neither am I asking that the indicators in the TM be sort of combined with the carbon intensity reduction target. You said you will switch to natural gas, but I wonder how you can prove that you have really cut down on the emission of CO2 in the vicinity. I'm just asking whether you can put in, say, a measurement device and put it within the TM and say, if you switch to natural gas, then you can cut down on the emission of CO2. But can it really be done in the way you said it? Is there a measurable device to do it, to help you with gauging the situation? I'm not asking for some sort of technological breakthroughs to cut down on CO2 emission from chimneys. No, don't misunderstand me. Director, when we measure carbon, CO2, we do have an emission checklist. And that is in accordance with IPCC and international practice. So we can make calculation on CO2 emission at the source. From a layman's perspective, well, maybe you can measure it in the chimney, and at least we can have a monitor. And then we can also look at the checklist and see if you can achieve the target. But do you have any devices in your chimneys to collect the relevant data? So, well, we are making the calculation based on the use of fuel. So you have regard to the quantity of fuel used, and then you make calculations. But you're just making calculations based on that. But do you have any empirical data? Do you make measurements at the chimneys?
I understand the member's concern, but we need to look at the international practice in measuring carbon footprint of different places, a city, a country. A power plant is a source, raising or keeping cattle or sheep can also be a source of emission. So we have some international standards to go by. If you use such a fuel mix, you can come up with an estimate of the carbon footprint. We adopt the most appropriate method internationally. So we follow the international practice in short. I'm just curious, are there anything where you can do when it's not feasible to measure the emissions from the chimney, for example, say PM 2.5 or carbon? I know that there are other sources in the environment, but power plants is one of the biggest polluters. So can we do something at the source to monitor? Yes, I know members are very interested in this. Similar questions were asked previously when we talk about SO2 and particulates. We do have an internationally accepted method to measure the emissions at the chimney. But we have said this. We don't think that this is the most appropriate technology to use. So we would rather rely on the best international practices. Mr. Hui Chi-fung, first round 4 minutes for questions and answers. For this new TM, you would impose caps for the 2 power companies, CLP and HEC. In 2022-2023, you have assessed the power consumption, and for Hong Kong Island it will be reduced by 2%, but for CLP it's the other way around, it will increase by 1%. Based on the blueprint on power conservation, how can this be achieved? I have some doubts about whether you can achieve this. For the 2 power companies, the estimate would take into account the service areas. For CLP, because of the new infrastructure and the new developments, there's an increase. So we have already taken into account the blueprint and also the power consumption targets. So for 2022-2023, for HEC, there were a reduction of 2%. But if we don't have anything scientific or something like a formula which we can monitor and you can monitor, and it's also only based on your estimates, it's rather abstract. Well, you can be more aggressive, saying that under the blueprint there's much more power will be saved. If you cannot tell us that you can adopt a scientific formula to monitor the situation, then the TM would be rather loose when they submit their power demand projections. We'll check what subsequently happened, and when they inform us, they will also specify what new developments or new areas will see power consumption increase, and they will base their estimates on such factors, and we would assess whether the estimates are well founded. Can you give us past information on how the estimates in the past were calculated? And if you don't have any concrete measures to monitor the blueprint on conservation of power, then it's difficult to monitor, and it would not be credible in the eyes of the public. On the power demand estimated by the 2 power companies, we can provide further information. Other members have questions? All right, so that concludes this item. At the end of this year, the government will table the technical memorandum, which is subject to negative vetting. The technical memorandum will regulate the emission allowances for power plants. So that's the end of this item. AOB. Well, this is the last meeting of the panel in the current legislative session. I thank members for their active participation. Mr. Stephen Ho, you have another question? Thank you. Thank you for chairing this last meeting of the panel. Well, it's my job. No need to thank me. In the next session, we are going to elect a new chairman and deputy chairman. We will issue a circular in due course. If there's nothing under AOB, meetings adjourned. Thank you.